pray again. Lord, I thank you for this morning. I thank you for the time of worship that we've had, for your faithfulness and your goodness to us. I thank you, Lord, that your goodness runs after us. And I pray, Lord, that we would experience that and know that today through your word as we spend this time together. Lord, reveal more of your faithfulness and goodness, Lord, to us. We want to offer this time to you and pray, Lord, that you would speak. In Jesus' name, amen. Group dynamics. It can be a tricky thing, right? Whether you're talking about a church or a team of some kind or a family, group dynamics are tricky. I grew up in a family that I think is one of the most unique families around. So I was just on Salt Spring the last few days with my kids and my wife, visiting my sister there. So inevitably, as we're talking about the family that we grew up in. And I really believe this. I know some of you think that you have weird families, that you have dysfunctional families. I think I maybe take the cake. My family growing up, I've sometimes thought that if I took like the real life characters in my family to a producer of some kind and proposed a sitcom, that they would reject it because it would seem too contrived and too unrealistic. They'd be like, there's no way any family is like that. And I'm not going to go into detail about it because this is being live streamed and they might watch this. But you can ask me later if you want the details. But in any case, gathering together as a family can be sometimes tricky. There are a lot of different dynamics to navigate with that. And group dynamics are even trickier when you have subgroups within a larger group that have competing interests. And it gets even trickier than that. When one of those subgroups in the group really believes, maybe with some good reason, that they have been given a status and privileges from God that make them superior to the other group. It's like, well, God just loves our group more than yours. Sorry, but not sorry. And that's kind of the situation that Paul's writing into in the church in Rome, where you've got this church that is made up of Jews and Gentiles. And then the Jewish people, Paul's people had grown up with this idea being instilled in them that because of the law, because of circumcision, because of some of these other things, that they really they had a status that the Gentiles didn't. And now all of a sudden, here they were in a church family, in a church community together, navigating different egos and perspectives. And if you can start to appreciate how complex that would be, how challenging that would be, then you'll understand why Paul spends so much time at the beginning of Romans writing about this, speaking about these dynamics at work here. So in Romans 2, we've looked at this the last couple of weeks. We saw how Paul was saying, look, my fellow Jewish people, we and the Gentiles are in the same boat here. We all are needing grace. We are all accountable to God. And in Romans 3, Paul is going to imagine a conversation. He's going to simulate a conversation with one of his fellow Jews who has heard what he has said and is going to have some issues with it and is going to do a little bit of back and forth here. So that's Romans 3, verses 1 to 8. If you've got your Bible, you can open it up or you can follow along on the screen. Romans 3. What advantage then is there in being a Jew? Or what value is there in circumcision? Much in every way. First of all, the Jews have been entrusted with the very words of God. What if some were unfaithful? Will their unfaithfulness nullify God's faithfulness? Not at all. Let God be true and every human being a liar. As it is written, so that you may be proved right when you speak and prevail when you judge. But if our unrighteousness brings out God's righteousness more clearly, what shall we say? That God is unjust in bringing his wrath on us? I'm using a human argument. Certainly not. If that were so, how could God judge the world? Someone might argue, if my falsehood enhances God's truthfulness and so increases his glory, why am I still condemned as a sinner? Why not say, as some slanderously claim that we say, let us do evil that good may result? Their condemnation is just. Let's go back to the beginning. Try to unpack Paul's line of thinking, his argument here. He has just said at the end of Romans 2 that some of these physical external marks like circumcision actually don't mean a whole lot unless they are reflections of a deeper heart change. That's what God really values. And if one of Paul's fellow Jews heard this, They might say, well, Paul, if that's the case, if these things that we have put so much stock and value into don't matter as much as we thought, then is there any benefit in being a Jew? What value is there in that? And Paul says, yes, there absolutely is value. And the main thing he points to is that the Jews had been entrusted with the very words of God. And this goes back to what we talked about last week. We kind of looked at the broad scope of the Bible, that the world as we know it is plagued by sin all over the place. You see that. And in Genesis 12, near the beginning of the Bible, God calls Abraham and says he's going to make him into a great nation. He's going to bless him. And we see that throughout the Old Testament, that God makes himself known to Israel, makes himself known to them through the law given to Moses. He makes himself known to them through the prophets who keep on calling the Israelites back. He makes himself known through various miraculous interventions. He's doing this again and again. He's making himself known to them. But notice what Paul says here, the word he uses. He says that they have been entrusted with the words of God. Now, if you think about that word, entrusted, it means that you have been given something, but it's not just for you. You have a responsibility to get it into someone else's hands. This happened to me this past week. I was given a relatively sizable check. I was entrusted with this to give to somebody else. Now, if it's for somebody else, I should not be going to the bank and depositing it myself, right? That would be faithless. Now, in this case, I didn't do that, but I did lose it. I did misplace it. And so I'm texting people, I'm like, where is it? Can you search your whole house? I've lost it, I don't know where it is. And then I found it tucked away in one of my books, which is probably a safe bet anytime that something's gonna be in my books. That's where it was. It was a big relief. But the point is that I had been given a responsibility that temporarily I proved to be unfaithful to get this into someone else's hands. That's what it means to be entrusted. Now this is important because the words of God given to Israel really did set them apart. It really did give them a privilege. They had a clearer revelation of who God is than anybody else. But it wasn't just for them. It wasn't just for their sake. And you see that as well in Genesis 12, where God says, I'm gonna bless you and I'm gonna make you a blessing. And all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. That God makes himself known, gives his words so that the whole world will be blessed through this. It's missional from the start. It's for the sake of the world. Now the question is, how do they do with this? How do they do with this calling, with this entrustment of this revelation of God? Well, Paul in verse 3 gives us a bit of the answer. He says, what if some were unfaithful? And this, of course, is true, that many of them were not faithful to the entrustment that God had given them. And this is true in a couple of ways. One is that they didn't always practice what they preached. And we talked about this last week, that instead of seeing the law as a thing that you were to obey, they took it and they used it as a way of exalting themselves. I pointed out that we can do this with anything. I do this with my Hyundai Scent. We can do this with all kinds of things. We take it, we use it to exalt ourselves. That's what they had done. And so they weren't a blessing. Instead, the name of God was blasphemed among the Gentiles because of them. But the other way that this is true is because of this very thing, that they had neglected the purpose for which they had been given the law in terms of making the Lord known to others. And Paul knew this firsthand. Paul knew that sometimes his people were not eager to share the privileges with other people. Acts 13 is an important story. It's one that I've talked about before. I think I mentioned it a couple of weeks ago, but I didn't tell you how it ends. So Paul and Barnabas, they're going around, they're preaching the good news about Jesus, planting churches all over the ancient world. They come to a city called Pisidian Antioch, and they do what they always did. Off the bat, they went into the synagogue on the Sabbath, and they announced to their fellow Jews, this is the good news. This is how God has accomplished salvation through Jesus. And people heard this and they were intrigued. They said, we want you to come back. We want you to tell us more about this. But there were some people in the synagogue that day who were not Jewish. They were Gentiles, kind of hanging out on the fringes of Judaism. And they heard what Paul and Barnabas said, and they understood that this was good news for them too. And so the following week, the word starts to spread that there are these two Jewish preachers who have a message that's good news for all of us as well. And so the following Sabbath, this is what we read happened, Acts 13. On the next Sabbath, almost the whole city gathered to hear the word of the Lord. It's packed, floor to ceiling, with Gentiles. And when the Jews saw the crowds, they were filled with jealousy. They began to contradict what Paul was saying, and they heaped abuse on him. One week they were intrigued. The next week, they were undermining everything Paul said. Why? Because Paul says they were jealous, or Luke in Acts says that they were jealous. And why were they jealous? They were jealous because this was supposed to be their thing. This was their thing, and all of a sudden, all these Gentiles are coming into it, and then there's this resentment. This is for us. This sets us apart. This isn't for you. And so as a result, they drive Paul out. And you know what? This is not like a Jewish thing. This is a human tendency. My favorite movie, as some of you know, is Jesus Revolution, which is this recent movie about the movement in the 1970s where many hippies came to faith in Jesus. And there's a scene in the movie, I think I've shown this before as well, where all of these hippies are starting to flood into Chuck Smith's little church. And the people in the church, the dignified, dressed up, sophisticated Christians, they don't like it. They're getting upset because these hippies come in with their bare feet and they're messing up the shag carpets. You can't have that. And so they complain to the pastor. They say, you got to do something about this. What had happened is that they had forgotten that they were entrusted with this, not for their sake, but for the sake of others, that this was actually their calling. They'd wanted to keep it to themselves. It was meant to be shared. See, this is the thing. Every blessing that God gives us is not just meant to give you warm, fuzzy feelings inside. Those blessings are meant to be a blessing, to be shared, especially when it comes to the gospel. And this is why the vision of our church is that we live to know Jesus Christ personally and to make him known. That we want to know Jesus. We want to grow in our knowledge of him, but it has to be spread. It has to be multiplied. It has to be made available to others. That's the nature of this thing. And so if you're a follower of Jesus today, I just want to encourage you and invite you to check your heart. Do you understand that what the Lord has given you, the good news that he has given you, is not just meant for your sake, but to be shared with others? Is there any part of you that wants to kind of shut people out? Maybe you've even experienced a blessing in being part of this church and you kind of think, well, this is my thing. I don't want to share this with other people. You know, like I was here first. If that's the attitude in your heart, I urge you to turn to the Lord and to ask him to change those ways of thinking, because the blessings he has given us, especially in the gospel, are meant to be a blessing to others. So that's where Paul goes in the first couple of verses here. He's saying, yeah, there is a benefit in having received this revelation, but it is for the blessing of others, and the Jews have been faithless oftentimes with that. Where he goes next still touches on some of that, but he talks more now about the faithfulness of God. We've looked at the faithlessness of people, the faithfulness of God. So one of the questions that you might have if you listen to what Paul said at first is if the Jewish people have been unfaithful with the covenant, then does that mean that God doesn't have to uphold his end of the deal either? So in any kind of covenant, so God had made a covenant with Israel. He had promised to bless them, make himself known to them. They were to live lives that were set apart for God. That was the covenant. If one side doesn't keep their end of the deal, is the other side still responsible to keep theirs? If you're a renter, you'll know you've signed a rental agreement with your landlord. You've agreed that they provide you with suitable space. You provide a certain amount of money in return for that space. There are other stipulations too, but that's the core of it. And so if one day you come home and you've been keeping up your end of the deal and the landlord has changed the locks and has brought a new family to live in the space instead of you, are you still gonna pay rent to them? I hope not. You probably aren't gonna do that. You're probably gonna bring them to court is what you're probably gonna do. But they have broken their end of the deal. You're not responsible to keep up your end either. So this is an understandable question. Does Israel's faithlessness cancel out God's faithfulness? If one side breaks their deal, does the other side keep their deal too? Does it cancel it out? And Paul's response here is as strong as it can be. Doesn't come across as much in English. He says, not at all. The Greek phrase, you want to learn some Greek today? Woo, 6 people. Meganoita, that's what he says. And you guys say it with like definitive, meganoita, something like that. Because it's the strongest possible negation. Like you could not be stronger than this, where Paul is saying, no, never, not at all. He says it 10 times in Romans. He often brings this out. He goes, no, like never, not in a million years, not even if pigs fly, not even if the Vancouver Canucks win the Stanley Cup, like never, never, ever, ever will this happen. That human faithlessness will cancel out God's faithfulness. And to hammer this home, Paul says, look, let God be true and every human being a liar. And when he says that, he's not wishing this. He's not saying, I really hope that every human is a liar. He's stating a fact that human beings have an issue with this, with making commitments and then sticking to them when things get tough. I see this in all kinds of ways, the fickle nature of human beings. As a pastor, I'll sometimes meet someone who comes to our church for the first time and they go, I love this church. This is such a great church. I'm going to be here every single Sunday from now on. And then I literally never see them again. You're like, what happened? Right? We do this with plans. People in Vancouver are famous for this. You know, you make a plan, you put it in your calendar, you put the Kaleo thing in your calendar this morning. But then all of a sudden, something better, something more attractive comes up. And now you got to figure out a way to break your first plans because you're just going to go with the best option, right? And so you text them, you come up with some lame excuse. Whatever, like my hair is on fire. I don't know, whatever it is. Can't do it anymore. And you ghost them, right? You break your commitment because something better came up. And we do this with marriage. I mean, on the marriage day, you make this promise to your spouse. You're devoting your life to them in this way. You're going to love them above all else no matter what happens. And it's easy to make that kind of commitment when you're both looking your best and you're with friends and family and everything's really romantic. You're all doughy-eyed. Oh, I love you so much. And whatever. It's a whole other matter. A decade down the road and your spouse is kind of being a jerk to you and you see someone else who is pretty attractive and they don't seem to be a jerk and all of a sudden your mind starts to wander because it's pretty tough to keep the commitment when things get rough. And this isn't to say it's pointless to even try. Just give in, lean in fully to the fickleness because you're going to anyway. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying this needs to lead us to repentance, to grief for the fickleness that often exists in our hearts. And again, this is true of all of us. And I think even what Paul quotes in verse 4 is evidence of this. If you've got one of those old-fashioned, non-digital Bibles, you'll see a footnote. Actually, maybe if you have one of those fancy new digital Bibles, you might have the footnote too. But in verse 4, Paul quotes Psalm 51. And Psalm 51 is a well-known psalm because it's one of the few psalms that is attached to a very specific historical context, which is David's affair with Bathsheba. So David, one day he's on the rooftop and he sees this woman taking a bath on her roof, which is like, by the way, don't take baths on your rooftops. That's just like a general life lesson. That's a free hint for you, free little life tip for you. Don't do it. Bad things happen. So David sees this. He's filled with lust. He summons this woman to the palace, sleeps with her, impregnates her, has her husband killed in battle, and then marries her. Pretty spectacular failure here. And where David is being faithless. The commitments he's made as a king, as a leader of the people, the commander of the army even, he's being totally faithless. And the startling thing is that King David is called a man after God's own heart. And partly it's because he wrote a psalm like this, that he was filled with a deep sorrow for his sin later on and repented of it. But his faithfulness is kind of what every later king is measured against. He's like the gold standard, even though at least in this one instance, he was really, he was a scoundrel. Which is, again, not to say, therefore, you're justified in breaking your commitments, but to say that nobody gets to stand above everybody else and say, well, I'm superior to you in this. I am faithful. You're not. I don't struggle with this. You're guilty of it. We're, again, this is kind of the theme early on in Romans. We're all in the same boat here. All of us have this fickle character to some extent or another. Paul says, let every human be a liar, but let God be true. He's different from us. He is faithful. And we see that again and again in the scriptures. This is one of the things that we see repeated over and over about his character. 2 Timothy, Paul says, if we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot disown himself. Moses says in Deuteronomy, know therefore that the Lord your God is God. He is the faithful God, keeping his covenant of love to 1,000 generations of those who love him and keep his commandments. He is the faithful God. Psalm 36 says, your love, Lord, reaches to the heavens, your faithfulness to the skies. This is who he is. He is rock solid. He's not fickle. He's consistent. He is steady. You could build your life on him because he is the rock. What he says goes. You can trust him because he is unwaveringly faithful. But his faithfulness cuts in a couple of different directions. So on one hand, God is faithful because he is so totally committed to bringing salvation to the ends of the earth. And through Israel, actually. He is committed to this thing that he told Abraham that he was going to do. When you read the Old Testament, you see this, how God sends prophets to keep on calling Israel back. Even when Israel falls into idolatry and they're conquered by foreign nations and they're oppressed, God calls, or they call it to God, and God sends a rescuer. He brings relief. It's just like this dogged pursuit that you see in the Old Testament where God will just not let them go. And this comes to a head. It comes to fruition in a passage like Isaiah 49, where it's kind of like everybody has failed at this calling to bring this blessing to the nations, to bring salvation to the ends of the earth. And God says, I'm going to call a servant, someone who is going to represent all of Israel, and they're going to do this. Isaiah 49, God says to this servant figure, this mysterious servant figure, it is too small a thing for you to be my servant, to restore the tribes of Jacob and bring back those of Israel I have kept. I will also make you a light for the Gentiles, that my salvation may reach to the ends of the earth. God says, I'm going to choose even just one faithful person, representative of Israel. I'm going to make them to restore Israel, but also fulfill Israel's calling to bring salvation to the ends of the earth. And the New Testament is clear that this is Jesus. That Jesus is this one. This is the extent to which God was faithful to his commitment, to his covenant. That even when everything else failed, even when every human was shown to be faithless, that God the Father sent his son to be a son of David, to be a descendant of Israel, to perfectly represent Israel and restore this calling and bring salvation to the ends of the earth. God is so committed to doing this that he even went to the cross, paying the price for our sins. That's how faithful he is to this commitment, to his promise to bring salvation. God is so faithful. But this faithfulness cuts in a different direction too. Because God always said that there would be a consequence for sin. That if Israel were to forsake him and pursue idolatry, and not just Israel, but humans in general, that there is a consequence for sin. This is God's promise that judgment will come because of sin. And he's faithful to this word as well. He is not like some soft and mushy parents who say, all right, little Susie, if you hit little Johnny one more time, no more screens for you for a week. And little Susie hits little Johnny one more time. You go, little Susie, I told you. I'm gonna tell you one more time. If you do this, no more screens for you for a week. And little Susie hits little Johnny again. And again, you say, this is the last time, little Susie. I promise you, there will be no screens. But it actually doesn't matter how many times little Susie hits little Johnny, because you need those screens. It's the only way you feel you can get through a day with little Susie. So it doesn't matter how many times she does it. You're not carrying out these consequences, right? That's what we as parents often do. We make consequences, but we don't follow through on them. And God actually is not like that. He actually is totally faithful in this way, committed to justice for the sins that we have committed. That's where you get the verse 4 there, how this brings together this dual character of God's faithfulness. Paul says, so that you may be proved right when you speak and prevail when you judge. Declaring salvation and enacting judgment are both aspects of his faithfulness. And here's what you have to understand, that this actually gets to the heart of the gospel. Because where do you see both of these commitments coming together? God's commitment to justice and his commitment to salvation. Where do you see those coming together? You see them coming together at the cross. Because it's at the cross where Jesus bears the full weight of the consequences of our sin, where justice is accomplished for our sins, and yet where salvation is made available to all who will trust in him. And so actually you have a choice. You can either bear the consequences of sin on your shoulders. You can pay the price of justice, or you can allow Jesus to do it for you. But in either case, God is completely, totally faithful. Now, in the last few verses of this section, Paul, again, is imagining he's having this conversation, the kind of conversation he would have had many, many times with fellow Jews who would then look at this and have some objections. They'd have some things to say. And Paul's gonna respond to that. He says, like some of you are gonna look at this and you're gonna say, wow, it really seems like our unfaithfulness brings out God's faithfulness. It makes him look even better, which is actually an incredible thing, right? That God can take our brokenness, our weakness, and he can accomplish good things with that. He can reveal himself through that. One of my favorite examples of this is in Genesis, end of Genesis, a guy named Joseph. He's a son of Jacob, who is also known as Israel. And Joseph is hated by his brothers, abused by his brothers. They actually sell him into slavery. I don't know if you had rough relationships with your siblings growing up. Probably not as bad as Joseph, right? It was pretty bad. He gets sold into slavery. He ends up in Egypt, and God uses Joseph and the gifts that he had given Joseph to bring him from that pit to being one of the most powerful men in the world. At a point later on, Joseph's brothers are in trouble. They need help. They come to Egypt. They come to Joseph. They don't actually know that it is Joseph. When Joseph reveals himself to them, they're terrified. Even years later, they're still convinced that Joseph's gonna take vengeance on them. He's gonna get them back because of how they had treated him all those years before. But this is what Joseph says in Genesis 50. He says, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. I've said this before, I love how God is like this black belt master, like spiritual jujitsu practitioner, where he takes the schemes of the evil one and he's able to turn them against the evil one to accomplish something good. It's what God does. So this part is actually true. But what some of Paul's conversation partners were saying, if that's true, then why are we being judged? Why are we being held accountable if we're actually making God look better? Actually, he should be grateful to us that we're screwing up, right? We're doing him a favor because he's looking better as a result. And I can kind of get that a little bit. The first full-time pastor job I had was as a youth pastor in a church. And the guy who was the youth pastor before me was like a favored son in the church. He was from one of these pillar families. Everybody loved him. He was ridiculously gifted. This guy ended up getting his PhD and became, now is like a published author and professor. And this was the guy I was following. Like these were the shoes I was filling. And honestly, many times I was like, I wish this guy had been a screw up. You know, because then I would be looking better right now, but this is a really tough act to follow. Would have done me a favor. So I get the objection. But Paul says it's actually dead on arrival. Because one of the things that sets God apart, one of the very aspects of his faithfulness is his commitment to justice. And so if he were to let people off the hook because he's actually able to do something good with it, that would actually undermine his own character of being committed to justice. So Paul says, no, I'm sorry, that doesn't work. Now, the other way that they maybe twist this is by saying, okay, if our faithlessness makes God's faithfulness look even better, if it brings it out, if it makes it shine because that's the length he went to for it, then maybe we should just sin way more. Because if we are even more wicked, that means more of God's grace gets shown. And who doesn't want more grace? This is a good thing, right? So just sin like crazy. This is probably something that some of Paul's listeners had an issue with. They said, if you're preaching that we're saved not because of what we have done, but because of grace, it seems like that's a free pass to do whatever we want. Actually, I had a conversation last week with somebody who's quite new to faith, said that when she first started hearing me preach about Romans, she was really troubled by this because she thought the Christians were supposed to be moral people. And here we are talking about how you're not saved by your good works. And she was kind of like, I thought this was what it was all about, was being a good person. But she said that recently she's understood that those good works are to be done as a response to God's unmerited grace. So that's what Paul's going to get to later on in Romans. He's going to say this is why we live the way we do. It's in response to grace. But for now, he just says, if any of you actually believe this, or if you believe that this is what I'm actually teaching, that you should just like sin like crazy so that God's grace is magnified, he says you're still lost. You're actually still living under condemnation because you haven't understood anything about what this salvation is about. Now, those are faithless responses to God's faithfulness. How do we respond faithfully to what we've heard in this text? I want to end with 4 short thoughts about that. Four short conclusions about how we live in response to this. The first thing is worship. Notice how as soon as I said worship, these guys started showing up. Amazing. It's like we planned this ahead of time. A passage like this causes us to look at God and recognize him for who he is. And when we see his faithfulness, when we see how unlike us he is, the appropriate response is to praise him, to adore him for this. That's what we're going to do here in a few moments. We're going to sing a song of praise to God because of his faithfulness. A passage like this should also cause us to respond by confession. Just as we look at this and we see who God is more clearly, we look at a passage like this and we see ourselves more clearly. We often try to justify our faithlessness. We try to rationalize our behaviors and our mindsets. We try to prop ourselves up. We compare ourselves to others. We go, well, I might be a little bit bad, but I'm not as bad as those people over there. But what's needed is for us to come before the Lord and be totally honest about who we are. God, this is what's in my heart. This is where I struggle. This is my faithlessness. And to lay that before him, as we've been saying here in Romans, lay down all that self-righteousness and be so raw, so honest with God about who we are. Third way I think we're called to respond to this is by faith, by trust, not in ourselves, not in our abilities, but in Jesus. He's our only hope. He's the only one who can bring together justice and mercy. Like I said before, either we can bear the consequences of our sins on ourselves, or we can receive God's gift through Christ Jesus, through the gospel, for him to take that from us. trust in Jesus, trust in his salvation rather than in your strength or your goodness. And finally, fourth, I think a faithful response to this passage is to then live a life of gratitude to God because of who he is and what he has done. And specifically, that we seek to be faithful in our relationships with others. That when we've experienced the faithfulness of God, when we know that we have been recipients of his incredible faithfulness, of his willingness to go to the very ends of the earth to rescue us, that is actually what empowers us to be faithful in our own relationships with others. And I think that if we did that, friends, here at the Bridge Church, if we actually did that, we actually would be salt of the earth and light in this world where there is so much fickleness, that we would stand apart as those who are known for their faithfulness because they worship an incredibly, ridiculously, abundantly faithful God. Let's pray. And I would invite you, if you're today somebody who wants to receive this gift and trust in Jesus, maybe you'd pray something like this. Lord, I confess that I am faithless. I confess that I have not followed through on my commitments with you and with other people. And that in fact, I am worthy of condemnation. And I praise you because you're not like me. You are faithful from beginning to end, fully committed to justice and mercy. I praise you. And I trust in Jesus. I do not trust in my own abilities, my own goodness. I trust in Jesus, in his faithfulness. And I offer my life to you, Lord, that it would be lived in faithful response to your faithfulness. Lord, I pray for our church. I pray, Lord, that we would be set apart in this way. That you'd bring us to that place of overwhelming gratitude for who you are, and that it would empower us to be set apart in this world. Thank you, Lord, for your word. Thank you for who you are. Thank you for your faithfulness in the gospel. Amen.
Thanks for joining us at the Bridge Church in this way. If God has spoken to you through his word, or if you're wanting to reach out to pray, or just wanting to know more about our church, access our website. There, you can connect with us and also have access to other contents. We are a church that lives to know Jesus Christ personally and to make him known. We believe he is the hope of the world and wants to give you hope as well. We believe the best news ever has come in and through him. May you know him more and make him known today. We'd love to hear from you.